So, welcome to this roundtable organized by the Institute of the European, Russian and Eurasian Studies and Jean Monnet Center of Excellence here at Carleton University. My name is Agnieszka Weinar and I am an adjunct research professor at EURUS here at Carleton. It is my pleasure to be here with 5 distinguished panelists with whom I will discuss the ongoing Ukrainian refugee crisis. Since the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine less than 2 months ago, nearly 4 million people left Ukraine and over 10 million have been displaced. The scale of the flow and the short time frame in which it occurred have been unprecedented, at least in the European experience. Today, I will invite our speakers to share their views on this crisis, to put it into a broader perspective, both globally and from the Canadian point of view. So we will discuss who are these refugees, what are their particular needs and characteristics, what the policy responses have been, and what are the scenarios for the future? What can we learn from other situations like this around the world and in history? And finally, what constructive role can Canada play in supporting Europe, European partners, and Ukrainian refugees themselves? So with me today, as I said, we have 5 guests. James Milner is an associate professor of political science at Carleton University. He's a globally renowned researcher, practitioner, and policy advisor on issues relating to the global refugee regime, global refugee policy, and the politics of asylum in the global south. He's also currently project the director of LEARN, the local engagement refugee research network here in Canada. Our next guest from Poland, Maciej Duszczyk, is the professor at the Faculty of Political Science and International Studies of the University of Warsaw. He's a leading scholar on immigration policy in Poland with a specific focus on the labor market integration. He's also the vice rector for research at the University of Warsaw and the member of the board of the Center of Migration Research at the same university. The next guest who joins us from Turkey, Sima Oshiromas, is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at Bilkent University. Her research focuses on forced migration governance, social trauma, gender-based violence, and comparative public policy. The next guest joins from the heart of the European Union. Woollard is the director of the European Council of Refugees and Exiles, ECRE. ECRE is a pan-European alliance of 105 NGOs in 39 European countries working to defend the rights of refugees and displaced persons in Europe and in Europe's external policies. And last but not least, from Vancouver, so we are back to Canada on that list, Masa Kateb is a social justice activist and an advisor at Canada's first refugee advisory network, where she advocates for meaningful inclusion of refugee leaders in policy and decision-making processes. She is a leadership and growth coach, the co-founder of Quantum Care, and a traditional Syrian storyteller. Welcome, everybody. I'm really excited to to see how our discussion will actually evolve. And let's start with a very first question, which is, we hear a lot, at least here in Canada, but I think that this is also somewhat an impression that is shared globally, that this Ukrainian refugee flow is somewhat different from other flows that have been experienced, especially in Europe, but also in the more global context. I personally can only say that there, of course, are differences from the policy perspective. We know that, for example, the main reason why Ukrainian refugees could come to the European Union and find the refuge there very quickly was because they enjoy the visa waiver. So they could cross the border very easily as visitors and tourists. But we also could see the gender dimension. Now, I wanted to hear your views on what really makes this flow different and what makes it similar to whatever we have known before. And I wanted to start in Europe. So I wanted to ask Catherine her views. What is it about this flow that is so different for Europe?
Well, I noted three main differences in terms of this refugee population compared to other displacement crises in and around Europe. And the three differences: scale, demography, geography. In terms of scale, the number of arrivals in such a short period of time is completely unprecedented. In 2015, there were around 1 million people, mainly refugees, who arrived in a year. Now we've seen 1.5 million people in 7 weeks since the start of the invasion. The second point is the demography. The demographic composition. 80% of those arriving in Europe, elsewhere in Europe, are women and children. And this is partly due to the nature of the war itself, which results from an invasion. And men are obliged to fight against the invaders. This is something quite unusual in contemporary conflict, which is much more likely to be secessionist or characterized by chaotic armed violence, whereas this is irredentist and particular. Unfortunately, the targeting of civilians that we see is characteristic in general of contemporary conflict. And the third difference, the geography, the countries of arrival and the countries of protection. People are arriving in European countries which have not recently received large numbers of refugees. While some people are moving on within Europe to other countries, many are staying in the countries at the borders. And these are also countries that in recent years a number of them have been very hostile towards refugees. And the proximity of Ukraine, of course, is a difference. The fact that it borders the EU, this is a reason for the patterns of movement, but also a reason for the presence of the large Ukrainian diaspora across Europe, which is a relatively recent diaspora rather than historical. And those factors are influencing the pattern of arrival and then of settlement and of movement. The differences in Europe's response to this refugee arrival, this refugee population, I'll leave to the next round. And that's the political side of things.
Agnieszka, micro.
Can see. Maciej, we heard from Catherine that there is this big difference in the countries that are reception countries. Can you add and explain this, let's say, novelty or new reality from the perspective of Poland and Central Eastern Europe?
First of all, thank you very much for a very kind invitation. And then I fully agree what Catherine said as the I can say most typical differences between the previous crisis and current crisis. But if we take into account our situation as Poland, it's absolutely necessary to say that in the past we had one, I can say, similar crisis in the 90s when Russia invaded Chechnya. This is the part of Russia now. And in the 90s, we had 100,000 of refugees from Chechnya who crossed in that time, the Polish-Belarusian border. And all of them were welcomed in Poland, but only few states in Poland. Most of them decided to go to Sweden or go to Netherlands or Germany. But in the 90s, I can say we collected some experience how to react on the refugees influx. But of course, now the situation is different. During the last 7 weeks, 2.7 million of war refugees from Ukraine have crossed Polish border, and 600,000 decided to come back to Ukraine, because still in the situation, the West Ukraine is, I can say, quite peaceful. That's why the people, for example, try to reunite with the part of the families, because after the first week in Ukraine, a lot of them decided to left Ukraine. But now, when the situation is not so, I can say, bad than we could imagine in the past, the people also decide to come back to Ukraine. But still, we have now in Poland 1.4 million of war refugees, and we have to also add to this number 1 million of economic immigrants from the past, from the period before war, also from Ukraine. That's why I can say the diaspora of Ukrainians in Poland now, it is if we try to find a number, it is amount more than 2.5 million of Ukrainians in Poland. But where this is also absolutely necessary to say that now we have the two, I can say, crises, very different. On the one hand, we have the crisis on the Polish-Ukrainian border. This is a crisis, of course, due to war in Ukraine, but also we have the much more smaller but very difficult crisis on the Polish-Belarusian border. This crisis started in August 2021, and we have a lot of different differences between these two crises. For example, during the last 7 months, only 50,000 of refugees tried to cross the Polish-Belarusian border, but only few they did it, because a lot of them are pushed back to the Belarusian side, because these, I can say, refugees are different perceived by the Polish society, but also by the Polish government. For example, the Ukrainians are I can say, very warmly welcomed in Poland. But for example, the refugees from Syria, from Libya, from Afghanistan or Pakistan, who try to cross the Polish-Belarusian border are not so, I can say, warmly welcome on the Polish border. That's why this is the two differences. But I think so it is also very important to say what Catherine mentioned. It means this reaction of the European Union, because the people who try to cross, the people who cross the border, the Polish-Belarusian border, they have to request on the refugee status. And it means that have to be, they are transferred to the refugee camps, and then they have to wait weeks or months for the last decision. But in the case of Ukrainian, it is in the example of Ukraine, this is not the case, because we have the temporary protection directive, and all of the Ukrainians, but not only Ukrainians, but also the people with other citizenship are covered by the temporary protection directive, with access to the labor market, education, healthcare, and so on and so on. I can say that we have the free movement of persons in European Union, but this definition of the person is that citizens of the European Union, but now we have also something like the free movement of Ukrainians within the European Union. It is, I think, so very huge difference if we try to compare the previous crises. And maybe the last issue, which is, I can say, necessary to say, this is we try to compare current crisis with the crisis from 2015, 2016, but it's also there's a lot of different differences. Let's speak about the only about the relocation scheme, because in the past, in 2015, we have the mandatory relocation and then contingents, quotas for the member states, but now we have the, I can say, voluntary relocation. We have the solidarity platform, which is opened by the European Commission, and the countries, the member states can declare how many persons they are able to welcome, for example, in different countries. This is two different schemes, of course. Still, we are speaking about the relocation, but this is two different relocations. And when I talked to my colleagues from the European Commission, they told me, Maciej, for us it is much more better not to speak about the relocation. For us, it would be much more easy to speak about the movement of Ukrainians within the European Union, because the relocation we had in 2015. Maybe I stop now, and then of course I will try to speak to touch another aspects later on. Thank you.
Thank you. Because Maciej, you actually opened the floor to the discussion of the policy differences. I wanted maybe to ask Catherine to complement from the European perspective that question. What is different? What was the reaction in Europe that was different?
Yes, thank you. So this was the sort of second element of my comments. What is the difference in the political response? I think the first difference is that access is being granted at the border with limited resistance from states, at least so far. In the last 5 years, strategy in Europe has very much focused on prevention of arrivals, regardless of the cost or the consequences. And prevention of the arrivals of refugees and asylum applicants. And this includes using political, legal and physical measures to prevent access, including the use of violent pushbacks at borders, including disruption of search and rescue. So the facilitation, the open borders access is a major difference. The second, as mentioned by Maciej, is that the Temporary Protection Directive has been activated. This is a legal instrument that was adopted by the European Union in 2001, which had never been used before this current refugee crisis, a crisis relating to displacement. And there were lots of people who argued it should have been activated in 2015, including ECRE. And the Temporary Protection Directive is a tool for exactly this situation of large-scale arrivals of people seeking protection in the European Union. And what it does, it provides immediate international protection status to almost everybody leaving from Ukraine. And that's for at least a year, renewable up to 3 years. So they don't have to make an asylum claim. The instrument provides that they can if they want, but they don't have to. They automatically have a protection status immediately. And also important is the content of protection. So the rights attached to this protection status that was decided on by the EU member states are comprehensive. The right to work, to education, to housing, to social assistance. So that means that the focus can immediately be on integration. So that principle of integration from day one can, for once, be applied. So often it's a sort of wishful thinking. And then we also have the right to onward movement, the right to family reunification. These are being facilitated. Usually the approach within Europe is to attempt to oppose and prevent onward movement and also with limited respect for the right to family reunification. And finally, we see popular and political support for the refugees. In some cases, populations are more open than with previous refugee arrivals, but we shouldn't overstate this, because also in 2015, there were welcoming of refugees in many countries. But much more remarkable is the openness to refugees on the part of governments, and certain governments that are usually hostile towards refugees, and in some cases more hostile towards refugees than towards migrants more widely. And the EU itself, in recent years, the European Union, has been proposing lots of reforms, putting in place strategies that are also based on preventing access and restricting access to protection. So for the EU itself, we see a complete turnaround. Let me wrap up just with a few comments on why this might be. Race and religion. I think there are biases in asylum systems, as we all know, and that's what's influencing partly the policies in this case. We also have to look at the intersection between race and sex, because certainly young men of colour arriving in Europe are treated in a different way. The scale and proximity to Europe is also a factor. The scale of the displacement and the proximity to Europe. But it's also, the difference in political response is also due to security considerations. So there is a strong understanding that any kind of disunity, panic on the part of European states on the displacement dimension would assist Russia, would be to the benefit of Russia when it comes to the security and military dimension of this war. So there's some of the differences in political response, but also a few suggestions as to the reason for those differences.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Let me now then hear the reaction maybe of Saime. You studied the realities of the Syrian influx to Turkey. How can you compare the two situations?
Thank you very much, Agnieszka, also for including me in this panel. I will echo some of the points that have been raised by my colleagues and try to make the comparison in terms of the 2011 initial response of Turkey to the Syrians coming in and fleeing conflict in Syria, and the 2015, the continuous response and the response of European Union. I'll start with policies. There is an interesting similarity. Europe has responded in terms of an open door policy to the Ukraine crisis, and Turkey had responded with an open door policy to the Syrian crisis. When 2015 came, when there was what was called a major mass influx in the direction of Europe in the millions, Europe had not invoked the Temporary Protection Directive, but this time it has. And in the meantime, around 2014, Turkey had introduced a temporary protection regulation and had started giving access to health, education, labor markets, and relatively speaking, housing. And there's also another difference in terms of accommodation, which makes a huge difference. Europe is responding with the Temporary Protection Directive, moving of people into decent accommodation as they are available. And Turkey had started with temporary accommodation with huge camps. And now, as of 2018, 2019, most of them are in the cities. This will come up in our discussions in the medium and long term. And the second one, second subtitle that I have for our contributions is the context itself. Some of my colleagues have already highlighted that there is a major difference in terms of other influxes. In the case of comparison with Syria, what went on in Syria was considered to be a conflict that was a domestic affair, and those fleeing the conflict were received differently. And in the case of Ukraine, in the eyes of the international community, the reasoning is different in terms of who is fleeing what kind of a situation. The other issue that I would like to bring up is that countries that are receiving countries of protection or countries of refuge, some of my colleagues have highlighted this as well, are maybe having different policies over time, particularly throughout the past decade, with respect to countries of origin of people arriving from elsewhere, particularly trying to curb irregular migration have been countries which are of high income and middle income, but the Syrians have moved to the neighboring countries in the region, which were middle income and low income, and are pretty high in the Fragile States Index. That brings me to another issue. I think this particular context, some of my colleagues also highlighted this, is also a context of concurrent crises. These countries have just come out of COVID-19. They're also experiencing major political transformation, not only in public policy and also a policy sort of public attitudes toward migration, but also an economic crisis that has in fact followed the COVID-19 crisis. Another issue I would like to bring up is all over the world, we observe a significant diaspora support for Ukrainian arrivals. There has been support by NGOs and INGOs in other movements, but in this one, we also observe that Ukrainians all over the world are trying to be very sort of active in the kind of reception that their nationals are receiving in these countries. And also when we look at the data on Ukraine, we observe, I'll echo here one of Catherine's point, a very complex demographic profile, but also a very different ethnic profile. There had been, we will remember that Ukraine 20 destination countries and also top 20 countries of origin around the world, according to the IOM World Report, migration report. And when we look at that, the movement also is not only Ukrainians, but people who were living in Ukraine. Last but not least, I would like to mention the importance of feminization of migration in this particular context and the actual accompanying GBV risks. There is a lot of, I think, concern around whether these individuals are continuously at risk for being subject to trafficking or exploitation or any other perpetration on their path. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Saime. I think that this is a very needed perspective. So let me ask now James to complete this round. Can you comment and add from your own experience in your own research and share your views with us?
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Agnieszka. It's a pleasure to be with everyone today. I think one of the benefits of the pandemic is that we're able to bring perspectives from the different contexts, and I'm joining you from unceded Algonquin territory here in Ottawa, Canada. And as we've heard from colleagues from the European context, from the context of proximate to this displacement, I'd like us to zoom out a little bit and think about what we're observing with this displacement and to situate it within a global context of displacement, where for more than 70 years, we've had a global regime that's focused on ensuring protection for refugees, finding a solution to their plight, and within the context of the 95 million people in the world who are displaced. Now, every situation is different. So, you know, of course, the differences are manifold, but I think in thinking about the similarities and the differences, when we try to situate this within a global context, it is important to begin with the similarities. So, you know, in the European context, the scale of this flow is very significant and is quite unprecedented. But if we think historically, displacement in the context of India and Pakistan in the time of partition, where there were 10 million people displaced in a very short period of time, even in a contemporary context, Poland, with 2.7 million refugees on its territory, joins the ranks of Colombia, of Turkey, of Pakistan, these very major refugee hosting countries. 85% of the world's refugees remain in the global south, even with the movement that we've seen. And with countries like Lebanon, where you know, 25% of people on the territory of Lebanon are themselves refugees. And so, you know, the scale of the flow is significant, but not unprecedented at a global level. Also, when it comes to the composition of the flow, if we see historically that you know that in a European context, that the demographics of this movement is something that we've been paying quite a bit of attention to, But around the world today, 80% of refugees are women and children. So, you know, these similarities, I think, are quite important to keep in mind as we think the tools at our disposal. But I think the most important similarity that I want to highlight is the Article 3 of the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees talks about the importance of non-discrimination, and that the provisions of the convention applies regardless of race, religion, or nationality. And so what we see with the needs, certainly of those Ukrainians that have crossed the border, that are refugees in the European context or in Moldova, that the objectives of responding to the needs of refugees are the same regardless of where we find refugees. That first and foremost, it's the question of responding to protection, of providing assistance. That the core legal rights of refugees, and Catherine's point about the content of protection is so important here, that regardless of where in the world refugees are to be found, the fundamental right of guarantees of non-refoulement, to not be forcibly returned to a country where they fear persecution, those need to be upheld. And so later in the conversation, when we talk about the content of protection, safeguards of protection, those questions need to be raised. Likewise, the similarity with any refugee movement is to respond to the needs of both refugees and host communities. And the end goal in any refugee situation is the pursuit of solutions. So while there's a focus on the initial response, the ultimate goal is in finding those solutions. But the difference that I want to highlight speaks to what some of my colleagues have mentioned already, is this notion of, you know, in the context of response to Ukrainian refugees, in this case, for the time being, the system seems to be working. And I say that because what we have seen from this initial response from late February is that it demonstrated the remarkable effectiveness of the tools of the refugee regime, being when refugees are forced to flee for fears of persecution, that countries of first asylum allow temporary protection, that other states come to the support of those countries of first asylum through relocation, through forms of financial support. So this is being contrasted with what we have seen in the response in 2015, 2016, as has been mentioned. But I would also highlight it in a significant difference in contrast with the response that we see around the world to Syrian refugees, Rohingya, Afghan, South Sudanese, Somali, et cetera, And it's interesting that just last December at the high-level officials meeting in Geneva, questions were raised about whether the global refugee regime and its norms and its institutions, whether these were outdated. And I think, as Catherine raised the point, and I think in a very powerful way, what we're seeing right now is that where there is political will, where there is a sense of common purpose from the international community, those instruments of the global refugee regime can be made to work. But you know, in this conversation, it's not just responding to the immediate need and the conversation that needs to happen there, but the long-term concern about finding long-term solutions, durable solutions for all refugees in the world. And that's an important conversation that we need to continue. But my initial sense is that there are very important similarities, not only in terms of the scale and the composition, but the core principles that need to be applied. The difference here is there's a very different constellation of political interests that seem to contribute to the system actually working. Thank you.
Thank you, James. This is really interesting. You see, while talking to many experts, I also noted that in this specific case, the use of the word the refugee is actually very broad, right? Because it's not the strictly Geneva Convention and refugees we are talking about. We are talking about a totally different instrument. And I thought that was an interesting element that I learned from you today. So now I will go to the Canadian view on this situation. Masa, in your view, what is different, what is similar about the Canadian reality of the refugee accommodation in this particular case? And you can also talk about maybe how the Canadian reaction was different, and was it really different than before?
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me as part of this meaningful conversation. I'm joining you from the lands of the Coast Salish people on the west coast of the North American continent in Vancouver, BC, the lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. My homeland is in Damascus, Syria, and I have been a guest on these lands, and I appreciate being here in a place of where human rights could be spoken about and hopefully actioned upon. You know, in the last 2 years, the global pandemic taught us a lot, and it taught us that rules and policies are made by humans and can be changed by humans. We're the ones who are making the rules. And as James was just saying, when there is the will, the political will or whichever will in the decision-making processes, things come to life and unfold in the way that that the intention is meant for. Canada's response for the situation in Ukraine, and this is something that the Refugee Advisory Network of Canada, we have issued a statement about the matter, and as we have mentioned, we cannot be more supportive of the new and effective response mechanisms that have been put in place by Canadian government and others around the world, making ends meet to make a situation better can be possible and have been made possible in many ways. And I will not specifically go into the details of what Canadian government did. It can be found on the website, and for the short amount of time, I'm going to go more into the importance of saying that what Canada did in this specific situation for Ukraine, similar measurements have been requested as a response for other refugee situations from around the world. And at the time, the answer was that this was not possible. And when we see that this has been made possible to this specific situation, it brought and continues to bring concern to advocates and refugee communities in Canada and around the world. We cannot change the past. If anything, we can embrace the best thing that we can have from this present time. What we know is that exceptions, let's say, or tweaking the rules or finding reasonings and ways to make things have been made possible. With that in place, the Refugee Advisory Network of Canada has encouraged the Canadian government to extend those measurements to other refugee communities, and we appreciate also the recent message from the House of Commons of the Standing Committee on Citizenship, Immigration and Refugee on April 6th, as they also, I'm not gonna say also because they also have their own voice, but they were encouraging the Ministry and the Minister of Citizenship, Immigration and Refugees here in Canada to explore how those measurements can be extended to other refugee communities, and for Canada to practice equity and human rights I would say in the right way and in an equitable and inclusive way. Canada's innovative response has, it's not new. We saw this about 40 years ago, starting with the private sponsorship program, of how it started for a specific segment of society, and how now it's something that is more broad and it's serving a greater purpose. So how can we now seize this as an opportunity to say, however measurements were put into place to make life better for Ukrainian refugees, how can that now be embraced as hopefully a practice that can be developed for supporting all refugees with no discrimination? And when I say refugees, I don't specifically just mean refugees. We understand that this is complex, and we speak of internally displaced. I would also include it for folks who are internally displaced within their own country, who cannot even have the means of seeking refuge outside of their own country and then going through the mechanisms of being able to seek refuge. I hope this covers the points, and I look forward to conversing more.
Thank you.
May I jump in for
yes,
the
sure, you can.
Okay, thank
for
you.
the last words, because we have to move to the next point.
Yes, that is only 2 sentences, I think so, because this is, I think so, you highlighted a very important issue, because this is the problem of the definition. We discussed, for example, because we call, of course, our guests from Ukraine as the refugees, but of course they don't have the legal status to be refugee. That's why we try to find the appropriate definition, and we call them as the war refugees from Ukraine, because it is not only Ukrainians. This is the representative from 100 different countries. The students from India, from Pakistan, from Syria, from different countries. That's why it was not so easy for us as the scholars to find the appropriate definition. That's why we call these people as the war refugees from Ukraine, to describe all of this population who escaped from Ukraine. I'll stop here. Thank you. Thank you, Agnieszka.
That is a very important point, because actually I think that we have had this discussion also here in Canada, where we know that Ukrainian refugees, as we call them, they come here not really with the status of a refugee. They come here on a special temporary basis for 3 years, right? So they are not necessarily refugees with all rights that would mean, in a way. So I was reminded that I should tell the audience that they are welcome to put their questions in the Q&As here at any time. You don't need to wait until the end. We have more or less, I think, half an hour left to discuss the looking ahead part of our meeting. So we know that the situation in Ukraine will not end quickly. Well, maybe it will, but if it does, it won't be a nice ending. So we don't know what can happen in the coming months, even years. I wanted to hear from Maciej, maybe at the beginning, because actually I have you here already on the screen. What are the current needs of these people in Poland and in other countries that are the first countries of support? And what are the needs of the hosting communities that you can quickly maybe reflect on?
Okay, thank you very much. This is the, as you probably know, the assistance from Ukrainians staying in Poland is mainly organized by NGOs and as a part of grassroots initiatives of the civil society. And this is absolutely fantastic phenomenon. I think that this is my opinion, of course, but I think that this phenomenon will be described in the different literature on the political science, sociology, psychology, and so on. Without any signal, 50% of Poles decided to directly offer to directly aid to the Ukrainian refugees. This is absolutely fantastic phenomenon in my opinion. But now, after 7 weeks, we have something like in the Polish society, which we can call as the compassion fatigue. It means that the people are tired to offer to aid. That's why we need the systematic help aid offered by the government, also from the European Commission, the European Union. Because now the people who provided aid to assistance to the Ukrainian war refugee from Ukraine, want to come back to the normal life, I can say, because a lot of people offer their own homes, apartments for Ukrainians, but now it is the time to deeply involve of the government to offer to manage the crisis. But what is absolutely, I think so, we are facing now 3 most important challenges. First of all is the accommodation, infrastructure, of course, because we have still 1.4 million of Ukrainians in Poland, but a lot of them, as I said, are staying now in the private houses and apartments. That's why we need maybe not camps, because it is impossible to have the camps because the people can freely, for example, go out from these camps and go wherever they want, but something like what we can call temporary state centers, but not camps, of course. They can wait for for example, for the possibility to rent apartments. The infrastructure, maybe during the summer, it will be not so very important, because people will move within the Poland and within Europe. But I think so in the since I can say October, it would be the absolutely most important challenge which we will face. And the another issue is the education for children, because at now we have more than 650,000 of children, but only 150,000 were enrolled to the Polish schools. That's why our academic year, our school year, will start on the 1st September. That's why we have to spend a lot of time to think how we can provide free places in the Polish school system for the Ukrainian children, because they shouldn't lose their 1 year in their life to do nothing. Of course, it's absolutely necessary to do it. And the third one, I can say, which I would like to mention now, it is the healthcare, because we have also 150,000 old people with different illness. That's why we have to also provide them to access to the Polish healthcare system, which will be not so easy, especially after the pandemic. And then in the past we had also the emigration of Polish doctors and nurses to the other countries. That's why the Polish healthcare system is under pressure. That's why if we try to include more than 1 million additional people, especially more than 150,000 with the different illness, it would be a very big challenge for our healthcare system as such. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maciej. Catherine, can you add from your experience in other places in Europe what this could mean for the longer term, midterm?
Sure. Well, we have members in every EU country, but also in Moldova and Ukraine, where civil society organizations are continuing to try to operate in that very difficult situation. And I think right now what we're hearing from people is that they're faced with very specific practical challenges, which are sort of typical of any kind of humanitarian emergency where there's large-scale displacement. So funding, staffing, logistics, coordination, risk of exploitation and trafficking, local versus international dynamics, trying to maintain the role of local organizations scaling up, and the sort of tension that sometimes occurs with international organizations coming in. There's also another element that's worth mentioning, is that in a number of the countries most affected, in recent years, civil society has been under attack. There are, for instance, one of our member organizations in Hungary has faced all kinds of repression from the government there. So in some situations, civil society was in a rather difficult position, and in a position that was in tension with governments, and they now have to overcome that as well in terms of responding. If we take a medium-term perspective, looking from now until the end of the year, for example, a slightly different set of challenges emerge. And the first one is moving from this short-term emergency response to a long-term structural support for refugees. And I think these are exactly the kind of measures that Maciej has just mentioned, that it's about integration through access to those rights that are in the temporary protection decision, the education, healthcare, and so on. We're arguing, for instance, in Brussels to mobilise EU funding, EU agency support, to do everything possible to try to make sure that people can access their rights. A second, there's even before that, in a number of member states, there's a challenge with registration right now, and registering people so that they then can go into the next step of integration. Another challenge is maintaining popular and political support and maintaining unity within Europe. We could come back to that in the discussion. A third challenge, I think, is ensuring a more even and a fairer geographic distribution of the refugees across Europe and beyond. This is a sensitive issue because people don't always want to move on. As we can understand, people want to stay close to the borders with Ukraine. But the situation, I mean, as Maciej has described, but there's a number of countries, not just Poland, we would also say Romania, Czech Republic, Austria, really have extremely large numbers of people. And in some cases, those countries really are not able to manage. So ensuring that people can move on without making it obligatory that they do so, I think, is a major challenge. And the final challenge I would mention is something that we've touched upon in the debate already. This is about mitigating the damaging effects on the wider asylum systems in Europe and mitigating damaging effects on the global protection system as a whole. In the best case scenario, it's about trying to make sure that this response, which is extremely positive, we're extremely supportive and positive about the response of European countries and the EU itself, but this should be the response for everybody, as others have mentioned. What about everybody else? In Europe, there's a risk that resources are going to be taken out of asylum systems and put into Ukraine response. It's already happening. There's even a risk of a harsher response to people arriving from elsewhere, in contrast to this positive response to those fleeing from Ukraine. So there's a number of different recommendations we're putting forward, I mean, such as, for instance, withdrawal of some of the asylum reforms that are on the table that go in exactly the wrong direction, and making sure that resources are maintained in asylum systems so that other refugees arriving don't get stuck for years without status determination and without access to rights. Let me just wrap up with just one small remark on perhaps what Canada's role could be, because I think that may be interesting for your audience there. I think keeping attention on the global system is extremely useful. The offer to host Ukrainian refugees is extremely important, and this is part of ensuring a fair geographic distribution, and it's also about helping maintain political and popular support in Europe, which will be easier if the level of responsibility is reduced. We can't make it mandatory for people to go elsewhere, but that needs to be facilitated and encouraged. In terms of Canada's offer, we do hear that the information being provided on the visa scheme needs to be clearer. One of my colleagues, one of our key colleagues here, is Ukrainian herself. She's one of Europe's leading experts on refugee rights. She said she struggles to understand the information. The other issue is offering some sort of guarantee of return, even possibly offering payment of return when it's possible to return to Ukraine. Because what we understand is that people feel insecure about going such a large distance from their country without knowing how they'll be able to go back. And the war is so unpredictable, nobody knows when this is going to end. So I think knowing that even if they go further afield, that they can get back is important. Possibly even a program of assisted voluntary return and reintegration being put in place for those refugees that go to Canada to give them the security that they can get back. Maybe a link with Canada's own promised contributions to the reconstruction of Ukraine, whereby people who go to Canada may be involved in training or support programs with the then possibility to apply that and be deployed in the reconstruction that Canada is supporting. And finally, perhaps a wider involvement of minority communities in Canada, taking the community sponsorship model a little wider. So for instance, there are 500,000 Roma in Ukraine, and they're facing particular difficulties in some of the countries they've fled to, where Roma people face extreme discrimination. And there are a number of Roma who over the years have emigrated to Canada, and it's a community that's not often involved in community sponsorship. Just one note there. And then similarly, one of the other issues we're looking at are refugees having to flee from Russia. So people who've opposed the war, people who are caught up in the latest crackdown on NGOs, or other opponents, it's getting even tighter. And there again, perhaps a role for Canada that has been less discussed so far. Thank you. Sorry to be a bit lengthy on that one. I didn't mean to be.
Well, you actually opened us to the last question, but I still want to pedal back to Saime maybe first to talk about the short-term, mid-term, and long-term challenges that you can share with us from the Turkish experience, and then I will go immediately to James to close that part when we move to the Canadian window of opportunity. Saime, please.
Right. I'll first start with one of the comments by Maciej when he talked about compassion fatigue arriving in 7 weeks, because that took about 7 years to arrive in Turkey. So it really worries me in terms of your questions, perhaps first to focus on the local people, because none of the refugee situations are short term. So I'll just try to reflect on the past, and thank you for giving me this opportunity, because there are lessons learned that could be important for Europe and Canada and the rest of the world, which are with countries which are trying to respond to this with compassion first. Turkey has experienced between 2011 and 2015 a period when these open arms and temporary protection regulation was really on the side of both the local people and who were forcibly displaced. However, if I could make this statement very clearly, the real blessing of the Temporary Protection Directive, which provides immediate short-term assistance in terms of protection needs, and my colleagues have already highlighted, there are 3 areas which are very critical: accommodation, health, and education, because there's a lot of social support and assistance financially, is also its major challenge, because it has the term concept temporary in it. Turkey has been governing this particular forced migration with the temporary regulation, temporary protection regulation, and also trying to put together a concept of integration at the same time, whereby these people's everyday lives are here. So if we pass through to another stage, when between 2015 and 2018, Turkey and Europe had a particular challenge, whereby the contrast in terms of the European Union's response to the Syrian conflict and the forcibly displaced, and Turkey's response had become clear. Turkey had actually, in fact, been the model for negotiating collaboration, because one of the major issues, and some of my colleagues raised this matter in other contexts, is responsibility sharing on the one hand for international protection globally, and also burden sharing, which is financial, which is also along the side of host communities and so on. So on that account, Turkey had this facility for refugees in Turkey, and this particular initiative could give an idea to Europe and other countries about the costs and also benefits of collaboration. And that is a very important start, because from 2018 to 2020, And of course, Catherine just mentioned this, we have no idea how long the war will go on or the conflict will endure. So that the perspective of making sure that people are part of the local population, even if they cannot pursue a complete social integration, that they increasingly become self-reliant. So the perspective switches from, in a decade or so, of help, support, compassion, to these individuals actually sustaining their own lives and having the resources to sustain their own lives. Because the different costs, social, political, take their toll. And if I could quote the Syrian Barometer, which has been a longitudinal study from 2017, and we just had the launch of the last one in 2020, the idea here is that 89% of Syrians who have been in Turkey do not plan to return to their country in the next 12 months. And when we look at the local population, the expectation is that they will be returning. So the first step for local communities is to be able to inform them of the particular scale of and temporal scale as alongside the financial of the matter, and keep their particular involvement as compassionate as possible as long as possible. Thank you, Agnieszka.
Thank you, Saime. James, would you like to step in with your experience?
Yeah, thank you. I would, and it's amazing how many of these perspectives really resonate with the global conversations on an effective, functioning global refugee regime. In the interest of time, let me highlight 4 critical needs that I think really need to be central to our conversation, and we can unpack these in the Q&A time. I also want to take Laura Matacoro's very helpful question in the Q&A box about the relevance of the 1951 Convention refugee definition in our thinking about responses, and whether these categories play a significant role. And I would argue that very few refugees in the global south, so a significant minority of the world's refugees, actually benefit from 1951 Convention refugee status. And in fact, the Convention definition has more often been used as a tool of exclusion to create a very high barrier of entry, as opposed to something that's quite permissive. So what has been mentioned in terms of the response in Poland, very similar to the kind of intellectual gymnastics that's required to understand what kind of category is created for Venezuelans in need of international protection, for example, who don't benefit from the 1951 Convention definition, but still need to benefit from rights and the guarantees that flow from the convention. And that really sort of notes that the most important need in all of this, and Catherine, I very much take on your point, is that individuals that are benefiting from these forms of response, first and foremost, must benefit from full and reliable protection and legal status. So it's something that we find in the Canadian context. It's even in reading with the temporary protection status in the temporary directive in the European context. To what extent is this something that's reliable, that brings with it the same rights and the safeguards in terms of non-refoulement, in terms of legal identity, that is quite central. And this is something that's been of great concern in the Canadian context, that yes, on the one hand, the fact that there's no limit to the number of Ukrainians who can apply for the special immigration measures to benefit from that opportunity here in Canada. The question is, what are the legal rights that come with that status? And that desperately needs to be unpacked. Number two, and Maciej, this absolutely goes to your point, and Saime as well, your notion about international cooperation really needs to be central. There's a very concerning logic that's to be the European Union can take care of this situation on their own. And there are two concerns with that. Number one is that, Maciej, the way that you presented it, that the response to material needs are coming from civil society actors, from NGOs, and that is a very tenuous relationship to rely upon. The goodwill is very heartening, but can it be relied upon in the years to come? The average duration of a refugee situation in the world today is 20 years. So to be able to imagine what kind of structures can be put in place to make sure that there's the ability to respond, not just to these, long-term needs, to the immediate needs in terms of health, education, social services, I think are quite critical. And within this, and Saime, to your point, I think there's a lot of learning that can happen. Maciej, when you were mentioning the needs of education and the school year starting in September, I think immediately of all lessons that we've learned from refugee education provision in the context of Lebanon, in the context of Jordan, in the context of East Africa, there's a lot of learning that needs to happen. And so if that's the third need is this need for learning and learning from other experiences, that just because this phenomenon is taking place in Europe, it doesn't mean lessons from other parts of the world can't be considered and potentially applied. But the most important need that needs to be addressed is the need for meaningful refugee participation. And this is something that I think has been of greatest concern, is that since the end of February, that the mood has been, what can we do for refugees? What can we do for people fleeing Ukraine? Hasn't been that conscious moment to stop and say, how do we involve those individuals who've been forced to flee Ukraine in our thinking of what are the needs and the priorities to which we can respond? In December 2018, the UN's General Assembly affirmed the Global Compact on Refugees. And the Global Compact on Refugees says that response is most effective when they actively and meaningfully engage those they are intended to protect and assist. And this is not just the right thing to do, not just an ethical imperative, but the meaningful participation of refugees in thinking about responses leads to better responses. I've had the real privilege of working with a colleague who's now in Berlin. She used to run an NGO in southern Ukraine, responding to the needs of members of the LGBTQI+ community in southern Ukraine, now trying to think about the response of this particular group with very particular needs now that they're in exile in Europe. And the specificity, the granular understanding of needs that she brings to this conversation, when you think about the great diversity, the heterogeneity within the population with the diverse needs that exist, that's something that I would encourage is if we're able to foreground our thinking more consciously and more meaningfully in mechanisms for participation, to not presume what those needs are. Catherine, your point about responding to those questions about the possibility of eventual return as part of a relocation agreement is an excellent example. Are there things that we can be putting in place so that the responses that are designed are viewed as legitimate, are viewed as accountable, and are ultimately effective? We saw in the Syrian response that things like the Jordan Compact and things like the responses like the Lebanon Compact, they were designed by states with particular interest without meaningful participation. They were limited in their impact. So let's not make the same mistake again. We have a good evidentiary record on the substantive value of participation of refugees, on the mechanism to ensure participation. And I think this is a lesson that can be applied in this context. Thank you.
Thank you, James. This is actually very important for me every time to hear that we really have to hear the people. When I look at the pictures, and I watch the news, I don't really see war refugees from Ukraine. I just see a crowd of single mothers, because I'm the mother and I'm just imagining myself, oh my gosh, this is really difficult. What do? You cannot treat them as any other immigrant, because I don't see them entering the labor market very easily, for example. If you have 2 kids in tow, and you are alone with that in a different country. So I wanted maybe for this last round also now go back to Maciej and ask him, first of all, what is it about the labor market policies that can be done for these women, for these mothers? And number 2, let's talk about Canada, what you would like to see Canadian government, provinces, institutions, organizations, or people do.
Thank you very much. But let me also to jump in what James said. I think so. This is we learned a lot from the different experiences, not only from Europe, of course. For example, this is the Jordan and Lebanon case is also very important for us to try to analyze these examples and try to use maybe the experience in our current situation. But I think so. The main problem is that a lot of war refugees from Ukraine don't want what would happen in the next weeks or months. That's why, for example, if we take into account this education, it's also the response to one of the questions. For example, we provide now in Poland 3 different, I can say, models of how the Ukrainian children can be the part of the teaching and learning process. For example, of course, this is 150,000 were enrolled in the Polish schools, but of course, this is with some of the deficits, for example, the language. That's why it is the very, very important tool to teach them Polish language, because without Polish knowledge of Polish, it would be absolutely not possible to be integrated into Polish school. But also we provide something like the preschool classes when we teach Polish for the children who are maybe in the near future will be able to join the Polish colleagues in the Polish school, but still it is the only few. But more than 450,000 Ukrainian children still learn remotely under the Ukrainians program, because their mothers think still that maybe in the weeks it will be possible to come back to Ukraine and start the new academic year in Ukraine, not in Poland. But still, I think if we try to observe the situation in Ukraine, this scenario is possible, but I think so I couldn't give the 100% this scenario will happen. That's why we as the country, we should be prepared also to enroll all of these children in the Polish school. Why? Because if we don't do it, it would be impossible. What Agnieszka mentioned, it would be impossible to offer any free offer jobs for the female, because in that time it would be absolutely necessary to care on the children. Also, when they are remotely learned under the Ukrainians program. That's why it is absolutely necessary to provide them the children care, and then this is open for them, and also open for us the possibility to offer for them any access to the labor market. And this is the connections between if we touch the education, we will open the different possibilities for the soft integration of mainly female in our labor market. But this is also the very important question, because we have now divided families. And it is the most important questions where this family will be reunited, in Poland, in Germany, in France, or in Ukraine. In our point of view, we try to treat we try to treat Ukrainians as the guest, as the temporary guest, because for Ukraine, it is absolutely crucial to have all of these people back after the war to rebuild the country. Because if we offer the free jobs for doctors, for engineers, or IT specialists, and they will be integrated in the Polish labor market, how we can imagine the reconstruction, rebuilding of the Ukraine? In our absolutely crucial point of view is to support Ukraine, because democratic, pro-West, free market Ukraine is in our Polish interest, but our European interest. That's why we should, our Ukrainian guests, war refugees from Ukraine, treat as the guests and offer them the soft integration, but not to try to integrate them very hardly in the Polish society or the German or other society. That's why we decided as the country to provide them this possibility to learn remotely under the Ukrainian program. I think there's also a response to questions which have been asked from the audience. Agnieszka, I don't think so that I answered your question, but I tried also to react what James said, but also what were the questions from the audience. Maybe two more sentences, because I think so very crucial. Still, we have the three scenarios. What will happen in the future? The first scenario is the frozen conflict, only in the east, but not peace agreement. It is very dangerous because on the one hand we will have the refugees, but also the economic migrants. Because without the peace agreement, I don't think so that a lot of different companies will invest in Ukraine again. That's why the scenario is very, very, I can say, liquid. But the second scenario is the peace agreement, which gives us also the opportunity to invest in Ukraine to rebuild this country. But the first scenario is, I think so, very unlikely, but still possible when we have, for example, in Europe, not 4 million of refugees, but for example, 4 million plus 10 million. It is possible. It would be, that's why this scenario is very unlikely, but we have to have this scenario somewhere very deep in our brain to also to be prepared for this, also the such scenarios. That's why I think so the temporary protection directive, I think so it is something like the pilot project, might be the pilot project. What would happen when we will have, for example, in the European Union, more than maybe 10 million of refugees from Ukraine. But I would like to say very, very strong, it is very unlikely scenario for future, what would happen in future. Thank you.
Thank you, Maciej. I want definitely to go back to Canada now, because we are in Canada and we need to talk about this country, what this country can do. We know that there is a lot of goodwill in the organizations among the people to do something, but it's so far away from us. So Masa, please tell us what you think we can do.
The sky is the limit. It's all about setting meaningful intentions followed by timely, equitable, and compassionate actions. We can do so much. And thank you so much for your stressing on the importance of education. Thank you, thank you, thank you. It's crucial. I would like to affirm what James was mentioning about meaningful refugee participation in solutions. It's very important to keep that in mind. Yes, when something happens, comfort zone breaks, we need to do something to fix a situation, and sometimes we think this is the best we can do. There's always room to do it a little bit better, to consider, okay, how can I bring those communities that I want to serve and bring them to be part of the solution, so then it's more impactful, it's more effective, it's more efficient. So thank you so much, James, for bringing it up. And it's definitely something that within the Refugee Advisory Network of Canada, it's something that we advocate for. It's something that we practice as a collective of refugees from different backgrounds who all reside in Canada, and try to support Canadian government in practicing equity through practicing meaningful refugee participation. So that's very important. The second thing I would say is community engagement. When, and I can give the example of the Syrian refugees, for example, coming to Canada at some point, everyone, and I wasn't here at the time, but I could see on the news of how everyone wants to be part of the sponsorship program. And yes, let's bring people in. And like now we see, yes, doors are open, come in. But then what? As Saime was mentioning, that this is not temporary, like this, we're talking about long-term, and we don't know when. We can only be present and prepare as much as we can for the future. So being able to consider community engagement and the power that can take place when communities are mobilized to take part of solution is tremendous. And through that, an example for me to say is supporting refugee-led organizations, supporting refugee-led initiatives within your communities, wherever you are. There are many. And for people in the audience to possibly, you know, like, you're here for a reason, you're meant to be part of this conversation, and what are you taking with it? How can you impact your communities, the organizations that you're part of, but then also in your own personal life, because it is in the daily practices. And an example is supporting refugees in finding meaningful employment. An amazing organization. I used to work for the organization previously. It's called Jumpstart Refugee Talent. And it is a refugee-led organization that supports refugees in finding meaningful employment. And Europe can learn so much from that concept of how can we bring refugees into being part of society, but be it temporary or long-term. Anyone can decide to travel from the country they're living for whatever reasons. So how come refugees are treated differently? So being embraced in society, already going through a forced displacement journey is very traumatic, to say the least. So, and we're all humans, like any one of us can be a refugee, really. I never thought I was going to be a refugee, but then life happens. And a learning from that is we all carry culture within us. So by us embracing refugees into communities and being able to support them in finding their own purpose as well through this journey is very important. A last thing I would say is non-discrimination. And like Canada has a big role, and I appreciate James earlier mentioning the Article 3 in the 1951 Convention relating to that provisions shall be applied without discrimination as of race, religion, or country of origin. And unfortunately, this is not the current practice that we are all witnessing in the world. So, and specifically, I would like to highlight non-white residents of Ukraine, stateless persons in Ukraine, Afghan refugees in Ukraine who are not being able to cross the borders, as per the reports that we are seeing, where there is discrimination happening. So it's not like, okay, this is happening in Ukraine, and then whomever is in Ukraine is being able to benefit from all of those things. But there is clear discrimination in what's happening. And Canada has a very big role to play in this, for us to be more vocal within the international community and encourage and speak of the equitable practices to other countries and other states, as these rights should be extended with no basis of nationality, but on the basis of need. And so that's a very important thing that Canada can do as a government. And I can't close without mentioning root causes. It is in our mandate within the Refugee Advisory Network, and it's very important for us to remember advocating and working and not forgetting about root causes. We're not just trying to deal with whatever is happening on the surface because of a challenge that caused this situation, but for us to remember that it is our responsibility as human beings to work towards a world of justice and equity to all beings, be it refugees, be it nature, be it climate, be it however we can do our part. It's important to take action and for us to lead action, not wait for others. I think that's very important, because we can all do something. And it's important for us to anchor into the fact that we are the leaders of our own lives. Whomever you are in the audience, whomever you are on the panel, thank you for all the work that you do, whatever it is. I'm sure it's taking us into the better direction, hopefully. And I encourage you to take leadership and in standing up for justice. It's not easy to speak the truth, but it's very fulfilling. Thank you.
Thank you, Masa. So we heard a lot about learning, right? That Canada has something to offer in terms of learning. James, what are your thoughts? And this is where we will close that panel, I think.
Oh my goodness! Don't give the last word to me. I really do just want to underscore some of the points that have been made by my fellow panelists. And Catherine, your points about the way that some of the provisions that Canada has been offering require clarity, but also require responsiveness to what we're hearing from individuals that might benefit from these provisions in terms of opportunities to return. I also want to underscore, Masa's point about the opportunities that can be leveraged from what we're doing now that might become tools in response to other situations. Canada's history on private sponsorship, for example, is this is a model that was developed in response to very particular situations, and it's now central to Canada's response to refugee situations around the world. So there's an opportunity with the alignment of governments, government political will and government engagement, to be able to monitor the tools, to improve those tools, to make sure that they're clear. The concern that Anna raised in a question in the Q&A box about how there's a very neoliberal concern that these unlimited numbers of Ukrainians can arrive in Canada, but without financial support, with a means to contribute to the Canadian economy right away, it raises questions about the neoliberal balance between providing opportunities to those who contribute to the Canadian economy as opposed to providing opportunities to those who are in greatest need for international cooperation. But the one point that I'd like to stress is that we really unpack what we mean by Canada. When we talk about what Canada can do, what Canada has done, is to really imagine that the government of Canada is one partner in what we refer to in Canada as a whole of society approach. So when we think about the role of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, when we think about the role of community groups across Canada, when we think about the opportunities for refugee leadership in Canada to make those points about equality and non-discrimination, I think that the experience to share is that international responses are most powerful when, yes, they adhere to the standards of protection and the guarantees of international refugee law, but when they release the innovation and the imagination and the legitimacy and the accountability that comes first and foremost for meaningful refugee participation in the thinking of responses, but the inclusion of society in a way that is going to address immediate needs, lay the foundation for addressing long-term needs, but also to ensure that those standards of meaningful and reliable protection are not eroded in the interest of expediency and being able to deliver on a politically popular response. Let's not forget that fundamentally this is a question of human rights and that those standards cannot be eroded in the interest of expediency. Thank you.
Thank you, James. That was a great closure, in my opinion. I think we basically heard the clue of our meeting here at the end. And we are at time. And what happened, we managed to answer 6 questions while you were giving your statement. So this is great. I think that we'll close it now, unless anybody has anything else to add at this point.
Maybe we should cross our fingers for Ukrainians to defend their countries, of course, because this is absolutely crucial.
Thank you, Maciej. I think that this is what really struck me when I was listening to all of you, is the fact that we live in the world where the flow of people is no longer just flow of people, just people who come and visit our houses, our countries, but they are also a part of the bigger security issues, right? And considerations around the globe. And this is a pity, but it's true. And I remember what Catherine said at the beginning. It's very important that at least in Europe, European states are able to stick together for another cause, right? Thank you, everyone. I think it was a very important start to the conversations that we will have in the months to come. And have a great evening on the other side of the Atlantic, and have the great rest of the day here in Canada.